Tacky old woman. You're just bitter because my parents have money, my daughter-in-law shouted across the dining table, loud enough for every single person in the room to hear. For a moment, no one moved. The silverware stopped clinking against plates, the quiet jazz playing from the kitchen speakers suddenly sounding too loud in the silence. I remember looking down at my wine glass, watching the pale reflection of the chandelier tremble on the surface, and thinking how strange it was that a sentence could feel heavier than the entire room. I'm Margaret Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and until that evening, I believed I understood exactly where I stood in my own family. If you're here listening to my story, stay with me until the end, because the moment my daughter-in-law said those words was the moment everything began to change. The dinner had started the way most family dinners do in America, polite smiles, small talk about work and travel, and the gentle clatter of dishes on a long oak table that had once belonged to my husband. It was our son Daniel and Vanessa's 5th wedding anniversary, and they had insisted we celebrate at the house Daniel grew up in, the same house my late husband George and I had bought 35 years ago when the neighborhood was still quiet and the trees were thin enough that you could see the lake from the back porch. Vanessa had chosen the menu, Vanessa had arranged the flowers, and Vanessa had taken it upon herself to remind everyone at least twice that the wine came from her parents' private vineyard in Napa Valley. Her parents were wealthy in the effortless way some people seem to be born into money, the kind of wealth that appears in casual comments about ski trips in Aspen or a second home near Santa Barbara. I had never minded that before. People have different lives, different resources, and George always taught me that dignity had nothing to do with the balance in someone's bank account. But Vanessa liked to talk about it. She liked the way the words sounded when she said them, the way people leaned in just a little closer when she mentioned investment portfolios and luxury resorts. That night she wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, and she smiled the same polished smile she always used when she wanted to remind everyone that her life had been very comfortable long before she married my son. Daniel sat beside her, nodding along with whatever she said, the way he often did these days. When he was younger, Daniel used to look at me across the table during dinners like this, a quick glance that said we both understood the unspoken rhythm of family life. But that night he kept his eyes on Vanessa, as if the rest of us were simply part of the background. I had spent the afternoon helping in the kitchen because old habits are difficult to break. For 40 years I cooked meals in that house. I set the table, folded the napkins, and made sure the roast rested exactly long enough before slicing it. Vanessa didn't stop me. In fact, she thanked me in a cheerful voice that carried just enough politeness to sound like something you would say to a helpful neighbor rather than your husband's mother. The evening drifted along in that careful way some dinners do, where everyone is pretending not to notice the tension quietly building beneath the surface. Vanessa spoke about her parents' upcoming trip to Europe. Her mother had just purchased a small apartment in Paris, she said casually, as if buying property across the Atlantic were no more complicated than picking up groceries at the corner store. One of Daniel's friends whistled softly, impressed. Vanessa laughed. My parents always say money is just a tool, she added, swirling the wine in her glass. You might as well enjoy what you have. I remember smiling politely and reaching for the serving bowl. My hands are steady for a woman my age, but that night there was a faint tremor in my fingers, the kind that comes from exhaustion more than anything else. The past year had been quiet and lonely since George passed away. After 39 years of marriage, the house had grown too large, too silent. Every creaking floorboard reminded me of something we used to do together, morning coffee on the porch, Sunday newspaper spread across the dining table, the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Vanessa suddenly leaned forward in her chair, her voice lifting just enough to pull everyone's attention back toward her. You know, she said, looking directly at me, it must be frustrating watching people succeed when you've spent your whole life settling for less. I thought she was joking at first. Some people have a sharp sense of humor, and I've learned over the years that younger generations sometimes say things more bluntly than we used to. But then she tilted her head slightly and gave a small laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. I mean honestly, she continued, raising her voice as if delivering a punchline, tacky old woman. You're just bitter because my parents have money. The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel chuckled awkwardly under his breath, the way someone might laugh at an uncomfortable joke simply to make the moment pass more quickly. One of the guests stared down at his plate. Another cleared her throat and took a sip of wine. No one said anything. I looked around the table slowly, meeting each pair of eyes for just a second. The chandelier above us cast soft golden light across the room, the same warm light George had insisted on installing because he believed a home should always feel welcoming. For a long moment I said nothing at all. Then I set my fork down beside my plate, folded my napkin carefully, and stood up from the table. My chair slid quietly across the hardwood floor. Vanessa leaned back with a satisfied expression, as if she had just won an argument no one else realized had been taking place. I picked up my glass, took a small sip of wine, and placed it back on the table. "Interesting," I said calmly. That was all. Just one word. And yet something about the way it sounded made the room feel colder. Vanessa blinked, clearly expecting something louder, an argument, perhaps, or at least a wounded protest. Instead, I walked toward the hallway without another glance at the table. As I reached the doorway, I could still hear the faint murmur of voices starting up again behind me, the awkward laughter people use when they want to pretend nothing uncomfortable has happened. I climbed the staircase slowly, each step creaking in the familiar way it had for decades. When I reached the bedroom George and I had shared for most of our married life, I closed the door quietly and sat on the edge of the bed. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. On the nightstand, George's reading glasses still rested beside a paperback he never finished. I stared at them for a long time. Vanessa believed my silence meant defeat. She believed I had nothing left but memories and old furniture. What she didn't understand, what none of them understood yet, was that George Whitmore had never been the kind of man who left things to chance. And the moment Vanessa called me a tacky old woman in my own dining room was the moment I finally decided it was time to find out exactly what my husband had left behind. The house was quiet after the dinner ended, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet that used to settle over the place when George was still alive. This silence felt heavier, almost watchful, as if the walls themselves were listening to every step I took. I remained seated on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands resting in my lap while the distant sound of dishes clinking downstairs drifted faintly through the floorboards. Vanessa was probably directing the cleanup the same way she directed everything else these days, speaking with that bright, confident tone she used whenever she believed the room belonged to her. A year ago the rhythm of this house had been completely different. George had been the steady center of it all, the quiet presence who made every decision feel thoughtful and deliberate. He was not the kind of man who raised his voice or demanded attention, but people listened when he spoke because he rarely wasted words. When George passed away last spring after a brief illness, the entire neighborhood came to the memorial service. Men he had worked with for decades stood beside the lake with their hands folded respectfully, remembering the way he ran his company with fairness and patience. Neighbors brought casseroles, flowers, and long stories about how George had once helped them repair a fence or fix a broken engine on a Sunday afternoon. I remember standing near the back of the church that day, watching people line up to shake Daniel's hand, and thinking how proud George would have been to see the respect he earned reflected in the eyes of so many people. But respect does not always travel the same path as inheritance, and it did not take long after the funeral for the atmosphere inside the house to begin changing. At first the changes were small enough that I tried to convince myself they meant nothing. Vanessa reorganized the kitchen cabinets so that the plates I had used for 30 years suddenly lived in unfamiliar places. She replaced the old brass lamp in the living room with a modern glass fixture that gave off a colder light. Daniel started working longer hours, or at least he said he was working longer hours. He often returned home late, his voice tired, his attention drifting somewhere else whenever I tried to speak with him about ordinary things. I did not confront them because grief has a way of making people fragile, and I believed everyone was simply adjusting to life without George. But gradually I began noticing patterns that felt less like adjustment and more like quiet exclusion. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. Vanessa and Daniel would lower their voices while standing in the hallway near George's old study. One afternoon I walked into the kitchen and found Vanessa carefully going through a stack of documents I recognized immediately. They were George's financial records, the same ones he used to keep neatly organized inside a leather portfolio on the shelf in his office. Vanessa smiled when she saw me, the same polished smile she wore at dinner parties. She said she was only trying to help Daniel understand the company accounts now that his father was gone. I nodded politely because that explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. But later that evening I noticed the leather portfolio had disappeared from the shelf entirely. Over the following weeks more small things changed. The spare key to the safe in George's study no longer hung on the hook beside the door. Daniel began mentioning the possibility of selling one of George's smaller investments, speaking cautiously as though testing how the idea sounded out loud. Vanessa often sat beside him during these conversations, gently guiding the discussion toward what she described as practical financial management. She had a talent for making her suggestions sound responsible rather than ambitious. She spoke about diversification, about modern strategies, about how older systems sometimes needed fresh perspectives. I listened quietly because I had never been deeply involved in the technical side of George's business affairs. My husband handled those matters with the calm confidence of someone who had spent 40 years learning exactly how money moves through the world. But what unsettled me most was not the changes themselves. It was the quiet certainty Vanessa seemed to carry whenever she spoke about them. She behaved as though every decision had already been made somewhere beyond my view, as if the future of the Whitmore family finances had been settled in conversations I had never been invited to join. The first moment I realized something might be wrong happened late one afternoon about 2 months after the funeral. I had gone into George's study to look for an old photograph I planned to frame for Daniel's birthday. The room still smelled faintly of cedar wood and the familiar cologne George used every morning before leaving for work. As I opened the desk drawer where he kept personal letters, I heard voices drifting down the hallway. Vanessa and Daniel were speaking in low tones just outside the door. I could not see them, but their words carried clearly enough through the quiet house. Vanessa said Daniel needed to think about the future and that emotional attachments to old structures often prevented people from making smart decisions. Daniel sounded uncertain, the way he often did when trying to balance loyalty and practicality. Then Vanessa said something that made my hand freeze inside the drawer. She said, "Your mother does not understand any of this. It would be easier if we simply handled things ourselves before she gets confused." There was a pause after that sentence, a silence that stretched long enough for me to hear Daniel take a slow breath. He did not argue with her. He only said they would discuss it later. I closed the drawer gently and remained seated at George's desk for several minutes, staring at the empty leather chair across from me. Until that moment I had believed my place in the family might simply be fading with time, the natural shift that happens when children grow older and create lives of their own. But Vanessa's words suggested something else entirely. They suggested plans forming quietly behind closed doors, plans built on the assumption that I would not notice or understand what was happening around me. That evening I walked through the house slowly, noticing details I had overlooked before. The kitchen cabinets Vanessa reorganized were not just rearranged for convenience. Important documents were missing from George's office. Even the conversations between Daniel and Vanessa had begun taking on a tone that sounded less like partnership and more like strategy. By the time the anniversary dinner arrived and Vanessa raised her voice across the table to call me a tacky old woman, something inside me had already begun to shift. Her words did not create the change that night. They only confirmed what I had quietly started to suspect. And as I sat alone in the bedroom George and I had shared for nearly 4 decades, listening to the distant sounds of the house settling into uneasy silence, one thought returned to my mind again and again. George Whitmore was not a careless man. If Vanessa believed the future of this family could be rewritten simply because he was no longer here to speak for himself, then she had clearly misunderstood the kind of plans my husband was capable of leaving behind. The next morning arrived with the pale gray light of early autumn slipping quietly through the lace curtains of my bedroom window, and for the first time in many months I woke with a sense of clarity that felt unfamiliar but steady. I had slept very little after the dinner, yet my mind felt unusually calm, as though a long unanswered question had finally taken shape during the night. Downstairs I could hear the distant hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock George had purchased at an antique shop nearly 20 years ago. That clock had marked every ordinary day of our lives together, its steady rhythm filling the quiet spaces of the house, and that morning its sound seemed almost like a reminder that time continued moving forward whether people were ready for it or not. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple navy sweater and the pearl necklace George once gave me on our 30th anniversary. It was not a dramatic choice, but wearing those pearls made me feel grounded, as if a small part of his quiet strength still traveled with me wherever I went. When I reached the kitchen, the house was nearly empty. Daniel had already left for work, and Vanessa's car was gone from the driveway, which meant she had likely gone to meet one of her friends for coffee or perhaps another of the charity luncheons she liked to attend. The silence in the kitchen felt strangely peaceful. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small breakfast table near the window, watching a few leaves drift across the backyard lawn while the morning sun slowly brightened the water of the lake beyond the trees. For many months after George passed away, I had avoided thinking too deeply about his business affairs. He always handled those matters himself, and I trusted his judgment completely. But as I sat there that morning, I realized something important about the man I had shared my life with for nearly 4 decades. George Whitmore was never careless with the future. He believed in preparation the same way some people believe in luck. Whenever a storm was forecast, George checked the generator, secured the boats at the dock, and made certain the emergency supplies were fully stocked. That careful habit extended to every part of his life, including the business he built from a small regional logistics company into a respected national firm. The idea that George would leave the structure of his life's work exposed to confusion or manipulation suddenly seemed impossible. With that thought quietly forming in my mind, I stood from the breakfast table and walked toward his study at the end of the hallway. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, and the familiar scent of polished wood and old books greeted me like a memory that had been patiently waiting for my return. George's desk still faced the window overlooking the lake, exactly as he liked it, because he believed clear water helped clear a person's thinking. For a moment I simply stood there looking at the room, remembering the countless evenings he spent reviewing reports under the warm glow of the desk lamp while soft music played from the radio nearby. Then I sat down in his chair and opened the top drawer carefully. Most of the papers inside were ordinary documents I had already seen many times before. There were company reports, neatly folded letters from longtime business partners, and a few photographs of Daniel when he was younger, standing proudly beside the first delivery truck George ever purchased. But near the back of the drawer I noticed something I had not seen before, a small envelope tucked beneath a stack of old account statements. My name was written on the front in George's familiar handwriting, the letters steady and precise. I held the envelope in my hands for several seconds before opening it because something about the quiet weight of it felt important. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The message George had written was short, but every word carried the unmistakable clarity of his voice. He wrote that if I was reading the letter, it meant circumstances in the house had likely begun shifting in ways that might feel confusing. He explained that the structure of his company and several related investments had been arranged long ago through legal channels designed specifically to protect me. George wrote that he trusted Daniel as his son, but business pressures and outside influences sometimes caused people to make decisions they might not fully understand. For that reason he had placed certain safeguards within the legal framework of his estate, safeguards that could only be activated by one person. At the bottom of the page he had written the name of an attorney I recognized immediately, Thomas Blake, the same man who had handled George's corporate legal matters for more than 20 years. George's final sentence was simple and unmistakably direct. He wrote that if I ever felt uncertain about the direction our family affairs were taking, I should contact Thomas Blake immediately and ask him to review the Whitmore Trust documentation with me in person. I set the letter down slowly on the desk, feeling the quiet gravity of what it suggested settle gently in my mind. The Whitmore Trust. George had mentioned that phrase once or twice during the later years of our marriage, usually in passing conversation after long days at work, but I had never asked many questions about it. At the time I assumed it was simply another technical element of his business planning, something meant to keep financial matters organized. But now, reading his carefully written words in the stillness of his study, I began to understand that George may have built something far more deliberate than I ever realized. Outside the window the lake reflected the brightening sky, calm and untroubled by the quiet drama unfolding inside the house beside it. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope before sliding it into my purse. For a long moment I remained seated in George's chair, listening to the faint sound of the grandfather clock echo down the hallway. Vanessa believed that money defined strength. She believed that confidence and volume could shape reality simply by repeating certain ideas loudly enough for other people to accept them. But George Whitmore had built his life around a different principle entirely. True power, he often said, did not come from speaking the loudest in the room. It came from preparing quietly long before anyone realized preparation was necessary. And as I stood up from the desk and walked toward the hallway with the envelope safely tucked beside my wallet, I realized that the next step in my husband's carefully designed plan was finally beginning to unfold. Later that same morning I drove into town with George's letter resting quietly inside my purse, the paper folded neatly but carrying a weight that seemed far greater than a single page should. The drive from the house to downtown usually took about 20 minutes if traffic was light, following the two-lane road that curved gently around the lake before joining the main highway. I had driven that route thousands of times over the years, often with George sitting beside me discussing ordinary things like grocery lists or weekend plans, but that morning every mile felt different. The trees along the roadside had begun shifting into the warm colors of early autumn, and sunlight filtered through their branches in soft gold patterns across the pavement. It was the kind of calm, beautiful morning that might have passed unnoticed on any other day, yet my thoughts were focused entirely on the quiet instructions George had written in that letter. Thomas Blake's office was located in an older brick building near the courthouse square, a place that had stood in the center of town for nearly a century. George often described Thomas Blake as one of the most careful legal minds he had ever worked with, a man who valued precision in contracts the same way a skilled engineer values precision in machinery. I parked my car along the street, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment looking at the polished brass sign beside the entrance that read Blake and Carter Legal Services. Seeing that familiar name brought back memories of the many evenings George returned home after long meetings with Thomas, sometimes explaining in simple terms how the two of them had spent hours reviewing documents to ensure every possible situation had been anticipated. At the time, I listened politely but rarely asked detailed questions. George handled those matters with confidence, and I trusted him completely. Now I found myself walking through the glass doors of that same office with a new sense of purpose that felt steady rather than anxious. Inside the building the air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, and the quiet lobby carried the calm atmosphere common to places where important decisions are made with careful attention. A receptionist looked up from behind a wide desk and greeted me with a polite smile. When I introduced myself as Margaret Whitmore, her expression shifted immediately to one of recognition and respect. She said Mr. Blake had spoken highly of my husband many times over the years and asked if I would like coffee while she informed him of my arrival. I thanked her but declined the coffee because I could already feel the quiet anticipation building inside my chest. Only a few minutes passed before a tall man with silver hair and thoughtful eyes stepped out of the hallway leading toward the inner offices. Thomas Blake looked exactly as I remembered him from George's company gatherings, composed and attentive, with the kind of calm presence that made people instinctively trust his judgment. He shook my hand warmly and expressed his sincere condolences for George's passing, explaining that he had planned to visit earlier but had been traveling for several months handling a complex corporate case in another state. When I told him I had found a letter George wrote for me, his expression became more focused. He invited me into his office, closing the door gently behind us as we sat across from one another at a large oak desk covered with neatly organized files. I placed the envelope on the desk and slid it toward him. Thomas Blake read the letter slowly, nodding once or twice as though confirming something he had expected. When he finished he leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together in a thoughtful way. He explained that George Whitmore had always believed in preparing for the unexpected, especially when it came to protecting the people he cared about most. Many years earlier George had created a legal structure known as the Whitmore Family Trust. Thomas Blake described the trust as a carefully designed framework that held ownership of several major assets including the Whitmore Logistics Company, certain investment properties, and the lake house where I still lived. According to the documents George established, I was not simply a beneficiary of that trust. I was the primary controller of it. Thomas Blake explained that this meant every significant financial decision involving those assets required my approval. No one else, not even Daniel, had the legal authority to sell or transfer those holdings without my direct consent. For a moment I simply listened to his words in silence because they felt both surprising and strangely reassuring at the same time. I told him that in recent months Vanessa and Daniel had begun discussing financial plans that seemed to assume control of those assets already belonged to them. Thomas Blake nodded slowly as if he had anticipated that possibility. He explained that George included several protective provisions within the trust specifically designed to prevent outside influence from altering its structure. Those provisions ensured that if anyone attempted to manipulate or access the assets without my authorization, the trust would automatically restrict their access to company accounts and related investments. In other words, the system George built was already watching for the exact situation I had begun noticing inside the house. As Thomas Blake finished explaining the details, he opened a large folder and placed several documents neatly across the desk in front of me. The legal language was precise but easy enough to understand with his guidance. Each page confirmed the same quiet truth George had written in his letter. The financial foundation of our family remained exactly where he intended it to remain, under my authority. Thomas Blake looked at me carefully and said that George always believed strength did not require loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes the most effective protection came from patience and preparation long before conflict appeared. I nodded slowly, feeling a calm understanding settle into place. Vanessa believed wealth gave her power because she had grown up surrounded by it. But George Whitmore built his life differently. He built it layer by layer, decision by decision, until the structure was strong enough to stand quietly against any storm. And as I gathered the documents from the desk and placed them carefully back into the folder Thomas Blake provided, I realized that the quiet plan my husband created years ago had already begun doing exactly what it was designed to do. When I left Thomas Blake's office that afternoon, the folder he handed me rested on the passenger seat beside my purse, thick with documents that quietly confirmed everything my husband had prepared years before anyone else realized it would matter. The drive back toward the lake felt different from the one I had taken that morning. The same road curved through the same rows of autumn trees, and the same sunlight shimmered across the water, yet my thoughts had settled into a calm clarity that had been missing for months. George Whitmore had never believed in dramatic gestures. He believed in careful planning and quiet patience. And now that I understood the structure he left behind, I also understood something else. I did not need to confront anyone. I did not need to raise my voice or argue across a dinner table. The system he built would reveal the truth on its own if people pushed too far. When I reached the house, the afternoon sun was already leaning low across the backyard, casting long shadows across the wooden deck where George and I used to drink coffee every Saturday morning. Vanessa's car was parked in the driveway when I pulled in, and through the living room window I could see her moving around inside with the confident energy she always carried, speaking into her phone while pacing slowly across the polished hardwood floor. I remained seated in my car for a moment, watching the quiet scene through the windshield. For the first time in many months I did not feel uncertain about stepping back into that house. I gathered the folder from the seat beside me, locked the car door, and walked toward the front entrance at an unhurried pace. The moment I stepped inside, Vanessa ended her phone call and turned toward me with a polite but slightly impatient expression. She asked where I had been all afternoon because she had been trying to reach Daniel about some financial matters involving the company. Her voice carried that familiar tone of authority she liked to use whenever she believed she was managing something important. I told her calmly that I had been in town taking care of a few personal errands. Vanessa nodded quickly, clearly more interested in returning to her own concerns than in asking further questions. She began explaining that she and Daniel had been reviewing some of George's old investment structures and believed it might be time to reorganize certain accounts to make the finances more efficient. As she spoke, I walked slowly toward the kitchen and set my purse on the counter, listening to her explanation without interrupting. Vanessa described several ideas about consolidating assets and transferring certain management responsibilities to Daniel so that he could take a more active leadership role within the company. She spoke confidently, as though the decisions she described were already approved and simply waiting to be carried out. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, perhaps assuming I would respond with the same quiet uncertainty she had grown accustomed to over the past year. Instead, I simply nodded and said that financial matters should always be handled carefully. Vanessa seemed satisfied with that answer because it sounded like agreement without actually confirming anything. A few minutes later, Daniel arrived home from work, loosening his tie as he walked through the doorway with the tired posture of someone who had spent a long day at the office. Vanessa immediately began explaining the ideas she had just shared with me, speaking with enthusiasm about restructuring accounts and modernizing the company's financial strategy. Daniel listened quietly while removing his jacket, occasionally glancing toward me as though trying to gauge my reaction. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water in front of me, watching the conversation unfold with the calm patience George had always admired in complicated situations. When Vanessa finished her explanation, Daniel asked if I had any thoughts about the plan they were discussing. I looked at both of them for a moment before answering. I said that any decisions involving the company or the house would need to be reviewed carefully through the proper legal channels before moving forward. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, clearly surprised by the formality of my response. She laughed lightly and said that legal reviews were not necessary for simple administrative changes within a family business. I did not argue with her. Instead, I reached into my purse and removed a single document from the folder Thomas Blake had prepared earlier that afternoon. I placed it on the table in front of Daniel where he could read the heading clearly. The title at the top of the page read Whitmore Family Trust Authorization Structure. Daniel's expression shifted immediately as he scanned the first paragraph. Vanessa leaned closer to see the document and asked what it meant. I explained calmly that the trust George established years earlier required my authorization for any financial restructuring involving the company or its related investments. Vanessa's confident smile faded slightly as she read further down the page. Daniel remained silent for several seconds, carefully examining the language of the document as though trying to understand something he had never been told before. Finally, he looked up and asked when I had discovered this information. I told him the truth. I said that George left instructions explaining how the trust worked and that I had spent the afternoon reviewing those details with his attorney. The room grew very quiet after that. Vanessa folded her arms and leaned back in her chair, clearly realizing that the situation was more complicated than she had expected. But I did not raise my voice or accuse anyone of anything. George always believed that the strongest position in any disagreement was calm certainty supported by clear facts. And as the evening light slowly faded across the kitchen window while Daniel continued reading the trust document in thoughtful silence, I knew that the careful structure my husband created years earlier had just begun revealing its true purpose. Daniel did not say much for the rest of that evening after reading the trust document. He remained seated at the kitchen table for a long time, turning the pages slowly as if the legal language might rearrange itself into something easier to accept if he studied it carefully enough. Vanessa, on the other hand, could not hide her frustration quite as easily. She stood up from her chair and began pacing across the kitchen floor with her arms folded, the sharp sound of her heels tapping against the hardwood echoing faintly in the quiet room. The confident tone she had used earlier that afternoon had faded into something tighter, something more controlled. She asked several questions about the document, each one phrased carefully but carrying an edge of disbelief. She wanted to know when the trust had been created, why no one had mentioned it before, and why the structure seemed to place so much authority in my hands rather than Daniel's. I answered each question calmly because the answers were written clearly within the pages she had already seen. George had established the Whitmore Family Trust more than a decade earlier when the company began expanding nationally. At the time, he explained to Thomas Blake that protecting the stability of the business was just as important as protecting the people connected to it. The trust ensured that ownership of the company and its related investments remained organized under a single structure rather than scattered across individual accounts that could easily be changed or transferred. Vanessa listened to this explanation with a polite expression that did not quite hide the tension in her voice. She said that modern companies often required flexible management structures and that too many restrictions could slow down important decisions. Daniel remained quiet while she spoke, occasionally glancing between the document and my face as though trying to reconcile two different versions of reality. Eventually Vanessa stopped pacing and rested her hands on the back of one of the dining chairs. She said that if the trust truly worked the way the document described, then any meaningful financial decisions would now require my involvement. I nodded and said that was correct. The room fell silent again for several seconds, the only sound coming from the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Vanessa finally sighed and said she supposed that meant any restructuring plans would need to be discussed more carefully moving forward. Her voice carried the tone of someone adjusting quickly to an unexpected obstacle rather than abandoning the plan entirely. I told her that careful discussions were always wise when significant financial matters were involved. After a few minutes, Daniel gathered the pages together and returned them to the table in front of me. He thanked me for explaining the situation and said he would like some time to think about everything. Vanessa did not respond immediately. She simply watched me with the same calculating look she sometimes wore when trying to measure the direction of a conversation. Later that night, after the house had grown quiet and Daniel and Vanessa had gone upstairs, I remained in the living room with the folder resting beside me on the coffee table. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated the familiar room where George and I had spent so many evenings discussing ordinary things like weekend plans or neighborhood news. I thought about the conversation in the kitchen and the shift in atmosphere that followed the moment I placed that document on the table. For months Vanessa had spoken with easy confidence about the future of the company and the house, as if those decisions already belonged to her and Daniel. Now that certainty had been replaced with something more cautious. I could almost see the calculations forming behind her quiet expression earlier in the evening. The next few days passed in a noticeably different rhythm inside the house. Vanessa continued speaking about financial matters with Daniel, but the conversations no longer happened openly in the kitchen while I prepared coffee or sorted the mail. Instead, they took place behind the closed door of Daniel's office or during quiet phone calls made from the back patio. Daniel himself seemed more thoughtful than before. He greeted me politely each morning and occasionally asked small questions about the trust structure, as though trying to understand the responsibilities George had placed within it. I answered those questions honestly because I believed Daniel deserved clarity about the system his father built. One afternoon I noticed Vanessa standing in the hallway outside George's old study, looking at the closed door with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering something she had once assumed was simple. When she saw me, she offered a brief smile and asked if I planned to continue living in the house long term or if I might eventually prefer a smaller place closer to town. Her voice was pleasant, but the question carried the quiet suggestion that the house might someday change hands. I told her that the lake house had been George's favorite place and that I intended to keep it exactly as it was for the foreseeable future. Vanessa nodded slowly and said she understood. She did not raise the subject again that day. A few evenings later, Daniel approached me while I was reading in the living room and said he had spoken with a financial advisor who wanted to review the company structure more carefully before making any recommendations. I told him that was a sensible step and reminded him that Thomas Blake would always be available if legal guidance became necessary. Daniel seemed relieved to hear that because he had clearly begun realizing the company was more complex than he previously believed. As the days continued passing, the tension that once filled the house gradually shifted into something quieter but more uncertain. Vanessa remained polite. But her earlier confidence had been replaced by careful observation. She watched conversations closely and asked questions with a precision that suggested she was trying to understand the boundaries George's trust had created. I did not challenge her or confront her about the past. There was no need for dramatic arguments or accusations. George had already placed every important piece exactly where it needed to be. All I had to do was remain patient and allow the structure he built to reveal itself one step at a time. About a week after the conversation in the kitchen, the quiet tension inside the house finally began revealing its true shape. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon while the sky outside hung low with gray clouds that rolled slowly across the lake like heavy fabric being pulled across the horizon. I was sitting in the sunroom reading when I heard the sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway much earlier than usual. He stepped inside a few moments later with the distracted expression of someone carrying news he was not entirely sure how to explain. Vanessa followed behind him almost immediately, her posture rigid and her voice already tense before either of them even reached the living room. I closed my book and looked up calmly as they entered. Daniel removed his coat slowly and ran a hand through his hair before speaking. He said something unusual had happened at the company that afternoon. One of the financial managers had attempted to process a transfer connected to a restructuring proposal Vanessa had been discussing with an outside consultant. According to Daniel, the system had refused to authorize the transaction and automatically flagged the request for legal review. Vanessa crossed her arms and interrupted him before he could finish explaining. She said the restriction made no sense because the transfer was only meant to simplify certain operational accounts. Her voice carried the same controlled frustration I had begun noticing in recent days whenever the subject of the company came up. Daniel looked between us and continued speaking in a quieter tone. He said the company legal department reviewed the request immediately and informed him that the Whitmore Family Trust automatically blocked any financial changes that had not been approved by the controlling trustee. Vanessa turned toward me at that moment with an expression that mixed disbelief and irritation. She asked if I had contacted the company directly to interfere with their work. I shook my head calmly and told her that I had not contacted anyone at the company since speaking with Thomas Blake the previous week. The system George established simply followed its own rules. Vanessa paced across the living room for a moment, clearly trying to process what had just happened. She said it was unreasonable for a system created years earlier to prevent sensible adjustments in the present. Daniel remained quiet while she spoke, his eyes drifting toward the window overlooking the lake as though he were beginning to understand the deeper meaning of the structure his father created. Eventually Vanessa stopped pacing and asked directly whether I intended to approve the financial changes she had proposed. Her tone was controlled but firm, the same tone she used during charity board meetings when she expected a quick decision from the people around her. I answered just as calmly as before. I said that before approving any structural changes I would need to review the proposal carefully with Thomas Blake and the company's financial advisors to ensure the plan truly served the long-term stability of the business George built. Vanessa exhaled slowly through her nose as if forcing herself to remain composed. She said the restructuring plan was not complicated and that delaying it could create unnecessary obstacles for Daniel's leadership within the company. Daniel finally spoke again at that point, but his voice sounded thoughtful rather than impatient. He said perhaps it would be wise to review everything carefully before making any decisions. The conversation ended there, but the shift in atmosphere remained unmistakable. Over the next several days similar issues began appearing in quiet but consistent ways. Vanessa attempted to schedule meetings with external consultants only to discover that certain company records required authorization from the trust before being shared. A request to access archived financial documents was redirected to the legal department for review. Each time the same explanation appeared within the company's internal system. All actions affecting the structure of Whitmore Logistics required authorization from the controlling trustee. Daniel grew quieter with each passing day as he began realizing how thoroughly his father had organized the company's legal framework. One evening he approached me while I was preparing tea in the kitchen and asked if George had ever spoken about why he designed the trust with such strict oversight. I told him the same thing Thomas Blake had explained to me. George believed that businesses often failed not because of poor ideas but because of sudden decisions made without patience or perspective. The trust existed to slow those decisions down so that every change would be examined carefully before affecting the future of the company. Daniel nodded slowly as if those words finally aligned with the man he remembered as his father. Vanessa, however, responded to the situation very differently. Her confidence did not disappear, but it transformed into a sharper kind of focus. She spent long evenings researching financial structures on her laptop and making phone calls to advisors who occasionally visited the house for short meetings in the dining room. Whenever she spoke with them her tone carried the determination of someone searching for a way around a barrier that had unexpectedly appeared in front of her. I watched all of this quietly because George always believed patience revealed more truth than confrontation ever could. The trust was not a weapon meant to punish anyone. It was simply a framework designed to protect the company and the family from decisions made too quickly or under the influence of outside pressure. And as the gray autumn days slowly gave way to colder evenings beside the lake, the system George created continued doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Every time someone attempted to move faster than caution allowed, the structure gently but firmly reminded them that the foundation of Whitmore Logistics still rested exactly where George Whitmore intended it to remain. The following week the house felt quieter than it had in years, but it was not the peaceful quiet I once shared with George. This quiet carried awareness in it, the kind that settles into a place when everyone inside it begins understanding that something important has shifted. Vanessa moved through the rooms with the same polished confidence she had always shown, but the rhythm of her steps had changed slightly. She no longer spoke about financial plans as though the future of Whitmore Logistics already belonged to her and Daniel. Instead she spoke more carefully, asking questions that sounded thoughtful on the surface while quietly searching for the edges of the structure George had left behind. One evening near the end of that week, Vanessa invited Daniel and me to sit together in the dining room after dinner. The long oak table where she once raised her voice now looked calm under the soft light of the chandelier, the same light George had installed because he believed warm rooms encouraged patient thinking. Vanessa placed a folder on the table and explained that she had spent several days reviewing alternative strategies with outside advisors. Her tone was calm and professional, the same tone she used when presenting ideas during the charity board meetings she liked to host in the city. She said that while the Whitmore Family Trust clearly limited certain actions, there were still ways to modernize the company's structure if everyone approached the situation cooperatively. Daniel listened quietly beside her, his hands folded together on the table as though he had not yet decided whether the conversation would move forward or stop where it began. Vanessa opened the folder and began describing a proposal that would allow Daniel to take on greater operational authority without technically altering the trust itself. According to her explanation, the plan involved creating an advisory board composed of several financial consultants who would guide the company's strategy while leaving the legal ownership untouched. The way she spoke made the proposal sound practical and efficient, almost reasonable enough that someone unfamiliar with George's careful thinking might have accepted it immediately. I listened without interrupting until she finished explaining every detail she had prepared. When she closed the folder, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for my reaction the same way she had waited during earlier conversations. I folded my hands together on the table and spoke slowly because George always believed thoughtful answers carried more strength than quick responses. I said that outside advisors could certainly provide helpful perspectives, but any formal board structure connected to Whitmore logistics would still fall under the review requirements written into the trust. Vanessa's expression tightened slightly as she absorbed that information. She asked if that meant every advisor she consulted would need legal approval before participating in company decisions. I told her that the trust required exactly that level of oversight for anything affecting the company's leadership structure. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment as though quietly reflecting on the situation. Vanessa closed the folder with a controlled motion and rested her hands on the table. For several seconds no one spoke. The only sound in the room came from the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant movement of wind across the lake outside. Finally Vanessa exhaled slowly and said she had underestimated how detailed George's planning truly was. Her voice was not angry, but it carried the careful frustration of someone realizing the path ahead would require far more patience than expected. I nodded gently because that realization was exactly what George intended anyone to experience when they approached the company too quickly. Daniel looked toward me again and asked a quiet question that seemed to carry more emotion than the entire discussion before it. He asked if George ever spoke about why he built such a complicated system instead of simply leaving the company to him directly. I told Daniel the truth as I remembered it. George once said that leadership was not something a person inherited automatically. It was something earned through understanding the responsibility behind every decision. The trust existed to ensure that no matter who eventually guided the company forward, they would first learn to respect the weight of the choices they were making. Daniel sat silently for several moments after hearing that explanation. Vanessa remained composed but noticeably thoughtful as she gathered her papers and slid them back into the folder. The conversation ended without raised voices or dramatic arguments. No one slammed a door or stormed out of the room. Instead, something quieter happened, something George always believed was the true beginning of wisdom. The illusion of easy control finally disappeared. Over the following days, the energy inside the house softened in subtle ways. Vanessa stopped making confident declarations about restructuring the company and began asking Daniel more questions about how his father used to manage long-term decisions. Daniel himself started spending time in George's study reviewing old records, learning about the strategies and partnerships that had taken decades to build. Sometimes he asked me questions about the early years when George worked late nights trying to turn a small regional operation into something stronger. Each conversation felt like another step toward understanding the patience George built into the foundation of his life's work. I did not need to remind anyone about the trust or the documents resting safely in my drawer. The system George created continued guiding the situation quietly on its own, shaping every decision without demanding attention. And as the cold wind of late autumn began sweeping across the lake outside our windows, the house that once felt tense with unspoken plans slowly began returning to something closer to the steady rhythm George Whitmore always believed a family home should hold. The first frost of the season arrived quietly one morning about 2 weeks after the conversation in the dining room, leaving a thin silver layer across the grass and the wooden dock stretching into the lake behind the house. I noticed it when I opened the kitchen curtains while preparing coffee, the pale winter sunlight reflecting gently across the frozen edges of the lawn. For many years George used to wake before sunrise on mornings like that, stepping outside with a cup of coffee just to breathe in the cold air and look across the water before the day began. Standing there at the window I realized how much the rhythm of the house had slowly begun to change again. Not dramatically, not in loud or obvious ways, but in the quiet adjustments that come when people finally understand the boundaries of a place. Daniel had spent the previous evening in his father's study reviewing old files and company records, something he had begun doing more often during the past week. When he came downstairs that morning he looked thoughtful but calmer than he had in months. Vanessa entered the kitchen shortly after, dressed for one of her meetings in the city, but the determined confidence she once carried into every conversation had softened into something more measured. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned lightly against the counter while Daniel spoke about a new logistics contract the company was considering with a manufacturing firm in Ohio. I listened quietly while they discussed shipping routes and distribution timelines, noticing that Daniel now asked more questions before offering his opinion. It was the kind of careful thinking George had always encouraged in his employees, the kind that comes only after someone realizes decisions carry consequences that extend far beyond a single moment. Vanessa eventually glanced toward me and said she had been reflecting on the trust structure during the past few days. Her tone was calm, almost reflective rather than defensive. She admitted that when she first learned about it she assumed it was simply an outdated legal barrier created by someone who distrusted change. But after watching how the company's systems automatically slowed down certain decisions, she had begun to see the structure differently. She said the trust forced everyone involved to think more deliberately before making choices that might affect the company's future. Daniel nodded quietly in agreement with her observation. I did not respond immediately because the realization she described was exactly what George had intended from the beginning. Instead I poured a second cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out toward the lake where thin mist floated across the surface of the water. Eventually Vanessa joined me at the table, resting her hands together while speaking in a tone that sounded more honest than any conversation we had shared since the night she raised her voice across this same room. She said she had grown up in a world where speed often looked like strength. In her family businesses decisions were made quickly because everyone believed momentum itself created success. But watching the trust quietly guide the situation during the past weeks had forced her to reconsider that idea. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat beside her, listening carefully. Vanessa looked at both of us before continuing. She said she might have misunderstood the kind of patience required to manage something that had taken decades to build. The statement hung gently in the air between us. It was not an apology in the dramatic sense people sometimes expect after conflict. But it carried the quiet acknowledgement that she now understood something she had not understood before. Daniel turned toward me then and said he had spent hours reading the company's early financial records the night before. Many of the partnerships George established during the first years were still active today, relationships built slowly through trust rather than rapid expansion. Daniel admitted that he had never fully appreciated the level of planning his father invested in every step of the business. Hearing him say that reminded me of a conversation George and I once had while walking along the dock many years ago. George said that building a company was similar to building a home beside a lake. Anyone could construct walls quickly, but if the foundation was not anchored carefully the first strong storm would reveal every weakness hidden beneath the surface. The Whitmore family trust was never meant to punish anyone or control the future from beyond the grave. It was simply George's way of ensuring that every person who eventually guided the company forward would first understand the strength of the foundation holding it in place. As the morning continued, Daniel began outlining ideas for improving the company's operations using what he had learned from reviewing those older records. Vanessa listened attentively, occasionally adding thoughtful suggestions but no longer pushing for immediate structural changes. The conversation moved slowly, thoughtfully, the way important discussions often do when people recognize that careful progress matters more than rapid movement. When Daniel finished describing his ideas, he looked toward me and asked if I believed George would approve of the direction he was considering. I smiled softly because I already knew the answer. George Whitmore believed in preparation, patience, and responsibility. And as I watched my son speak with a calm respect for the company his father spent 40 years building, I realized that the quiet plan George left behind had accomplished exactly what it was designed to do. The trust had not simply protected the assets of Whitmore Logistics. It had protected the understanding required to lead it wisely. Outside the window, the morning frost slowly melted beneath the rising sunlight, revealing the green grass beneath it just as steady and alive as it had always been. And in that quiet moment I understood something George once told me while we stood together on the dock watching the water move gently against the shore. True strength is not proven in moments of control. It is proven in the patience to guide people toward understanding long after you are no longer there to speak for yourself.